Hi, everybody. My name is Ember Kelly, and I am the Director of Religious Education here at the Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York, where I'm actually calling in today from, as you can maybe tell by this beautiful stained glass that is somehow in my office room because my office was an add-on to the room. But I am so excited to get to be with you all tonight as part of our continuing In Conversation series, where we bring in exciting new speakers to come and share a little bit about the work that they're doing and about things that are going on in the work that they're doing and the things that they study. And I am particularly excited to have the chance to invite and share the platform with an amazing friend of mine from seminary who went to seminary and traveled through that rigorous experience together at Chicago Theological Seminary. And so I am so excited to introduce to you all Reverend Jason Carson Wilson. Reverend Jason, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners today?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ember, for the invitation. I'm so glad to be here. So I'm, like Ember said, I'm Reverend Jason Carson Wilson, and I am the founding executive director of the Bayard Rustin Liberation Initiative, a DC-based, faith-based advocacy organization that is really focused on Black and LGBTQIA, Black and POC LGBTQIA liberation. One of just really was finding that our traditional LGBTQ organizations, while fighting for liberation for LGBTQ people, struggled to recognize the challenges that are faced by LGBTQI people of color, and particularly because I am a Black LGBTQI person, can really speak to the directly to the context from the context of Black LGBTQI people. I mean, so that's what inspired me to found that organization in April of 2018, and then I also serve as the Bayard Rustin Fellow for Community Renewal Society, which is a United Church of Christ affiliated organization based in Chicago that focuses more on state and local LGBTQ issues. That's what I'm leading there, but I also do federal advocacy of LGBTQ issues through BRLI, so Community Renewal Society and Bayard Rustin Liberation Initiative have a connection that we do that work with. And so beyond that, I'm a ordained United Church of Christ minister, and my after a career of journalism, started my seminary journey at CTS on September 3rd, 2013. I still remember the exact date and day and the feeling of walking through the doors, and really walked through there thinking, oh, I'm going to be a pastor and be assigned a church, because I really didn't, coming into seminary, really didn't have an idea of like, what does that look like? But have always really known that I am called to social justice ministry, but really didn't have any of the language for that. And so CTS gave me all that language and lots of opportunities, which I can speak to later, to do social justice. But then that journey ended up leading me to take a job as the Justice and Peace Policy Fellow for the United Church of Christ, a 2-year fellowship that brought me to DC in May of 2016. And so I've been here ever since, doing federal advocacy in various policy areas, but most recently a lot of that has centered around LGBTQIA issues. So that's me.
I mean, as someone who is also your Facebook friend, I'm always just amazed getting to see all the cool things, all these opportunities, like that fellowship, the things that you've gotten to plug into. Like it's really exciting stuff. And you kind of name it there that, you know, a lot of us went into seminary kind of expecting like very traditional, like I'm going to go to seminary and then I'm going to just be just a straight up normal pastor. Like, you know, that's really the only option, right? And I feel really fortunate that Chicago Seminary, that it expanded this idea of what ministry could be. I think the UCC has also been part of that journey, I know, in both of our lives. But at CTS, we were like, hey, there's more possibilities. And I know that one of those was like this idea of being a public theologian, or maybe in other words, maybe like a theological activist almost in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a concept that I was first introduced to at CTS, which I now find practically applicable in life. But that was the first time I ever heard of like you can be a theologically informed activist. Like you can do ministry work and have it be activism too. And my mind was blown at the time. Like I think the year that I started was right around the same time as the Ferguson uprising, and they had a couple of different speakers come in. It was also the same summer as like Baltimore uprising, and so you had you had people who were supposed to come speak at this panel who were instead calling in and were driving to Baltimore, and that just set such a good impression that being religious, being involved in a faith community, being ordained, being a faith leader doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be involved and active out in the world. Would you like to maybe discuss, obviously, like, I feel like the work you're doing kind of qualifies as being a public theologian. Would you want to talk about a little bit about this faith-informed activism kind of work?
I guess the first thing I will say is that the idea that it has become this there's been this idea that faith and activism is like this newfangled kind of thing. Because what I've come to realize is that Jesus was a faith-based activist, and his ministry was a movement. I mean, I've heard it called a movement, and I do agree with that Jesus' ministry was a movement. And I think what I have watched is Jesus' movement become Christianity, and I feel like Jesus' ministry and movement is different from the institution that is now Christianity, particularly since this institution has been used to create and sustain power for the powerful and not for the oppressed. And so I guess as I say that, like I ponder how I've gone through dealing with this institution we call Christianity. I was raised in a conservative evangelical church in downstate Illinois, where it was predominantly white, and I'm a biracial boy who was the first black grandchild born in a white family to a white mother. I don't know who my father is, and I share all that for context. That this church, in many ways, I felt it became a sanctuary, but I realized it became a sanctuary because I could feel God's presence. But it was a space that was also problematic because of some of the people there who had, frankly, racist ideas about black people and pushing the whole, propaganda around black people and welfare, etc. And then eventually, their homophobia would come into play, because I didn't come out till I was 27, but it was clear that I was different, and so I guess, and that's just part of the experience. And then again, the other experiences were and particularly in this context, were the quote traditional gender roles that they pushed around. So boys were expected to be ministers, girls were expected to be ministers' wives because, you know, they, and then also, obviously, the binary concept that, you know, non-binary was not something that they could probably fathom today. So I guess all that experience for me, living through that, eventually getting outed by the church and stepping away from the church for a while, then ended up pushing me to. I was always loved writing, telling stories, so I got my journalism degree, and I remember, you know, saying I'm negotiating with God, because we know that works, about figuring out another way to do ministry. So I became a journalist and decided that's how I was going to do that, and God made ways for that. And I think one of the biggest opportunities for social justice ministry for me, and also kind of some version of public theology that I had the first taste of, even though obviously I was in a secular, you know, space of a newspaper, and I wasn't necessarily, so I wasn't, you know, proselytizing or anything of that nature. However, there was a situation where I was in a town called Pekin, and there was a situation where there were, which is on the other side of the Illinois River from Peoria. So there was a situation where there were women of color who were struggling with substance abuse, who were, you know, financing that substance abuse through sex work. So these women were being targeted and murdered, and then dumped in the county in which I was. Their bodies were being dumped in the county I was covering. Now, the cop report of my colleague was just another black woman was killed, and just basic reporting. And I just felt this call to humanize these women. Okay, yes, this is how their life ended, but what were they like before? And ended up getting connected with a lesbian couple, Reverend Carol Hoke and Reverend Lauren Paget, who I'm still friends with to this day. They and they're UCC pastors, actually in my conference. And so they ended up creating this sort of support group for the victims' families. There ended up being a total of 7 victims. And so I went and interviewed each of the families as a group with them. And this was before Black Lives Matter. And so as I was doing it, I just felt I had this feeling that I couldn't really articulate. But I just knew that, and as much as I was, you know, doing my job as a journalist, I just felt like there was something more that that I was doing, and I was sort of feeling this call to do that, but I didn't know, okay, what do I do? How do I get there? And so that was the first, I think, inkling that I was sort of called to the work that I'm doing now. And then I ended up moving to another newspaper, beginning attending the church, and they were preparing to become an open and affirming church in UCC speak. That is the process that churches go through to officially declare that they're open to LGBTQ people. And so they decided to do that. And so once they did that, that's when God was like, okay, you've been avoiding this call for going on 30 years. Hello, stop. So the church that I was there essentially affirmed my call. And so I began that journey. So just began that journey and ended up at CTS. And I will say, when I first started down that journey towards ordained ministry, I was, one of my gifts is overthinking a lot of things. like I have lots of gifts, but overthinking is one of them. And one of the things for me was, okay, I've committed to this ministry, and I don't want to have anything to get in the way of it. So I'm gonna just not do journalism anymore, because I don't want to be in a situation where I think this is going to be the backup in case I decide I don't like being in ministry. So I tried to get away from that, but what I realized at some point was that God allowed me to get that degree on purpose. That was the whole point. I mean, that even as I did this journalism degree because I thought I was trying to get out of ministry, the guy was just like, okay, that's cute. I'll let you pretend like you're getting out of ministry. We'll go ahead and pretend that I'm going to let you do that. That's fine. But essentially, what journalism was just giving me tools that I am now using in the ministry that I'm in, because journalism is really so this public journalism or public theology, being a public theologian is essentially taking elements of what I learned in journalism and melding those together with theological reflection. And I will say one of the gifts of being a public theologian with a journalism degree is that I've learned how to write in AP style, which means essentially when you write, the stories that you read in newspapers are written in AP style, the Associated Press. And so for me, it's public theology sort of positions me in this space where I can have the best of both worlds of sharing theological reflections in ways that are hopefully most accessible to the most amount of people, because I've noticed some individuals who don't necessarily have my skills, sometimes important theological reflections are obscured by archaic language involving 9-syllable words, and sometimes there's a place for that. But also, if you're really trying to reach the most people, you also need to be able to distill that in a format. So I think that's so that for me is what finally, I guess, all that to say that once I realized that no, I'm not using my journalism skills, still using my journalism skills to avoid ministry. Once God helped me grasp that, it's really put me in the space of being able to really develop my prophetic voice in the realm of public theology. And also, on top of that, I think the other good thing about this is that I'm adding diversity, because there are a great many people with prophetic voices who are people of color. I mean, Tracy Blackman, Naomi Washington Leapart, with whom I count as friends and mentors, Pamela Lightsey, just a lot I could name, but I feel like I bring a particular perspective as a Black gay faith leader who has a commitment to interfaith engagement, because I think as much as I identify as a follower of Jesus, I believe that everyone is a child of the Creator, and So I try to make sure that I don't let anything separate me from someone else.
So there's so many points in there that I want to go off of. But I think, the way you talked about simplifying, because you do get a lot of people who do some, whether through effort or through sheer luck, end up with theological platforms, especially in the age of social media, that, suddenly some account on TikTok or Twitter is suddenly known for being like the hip, cool place for theological takes, but that they don't have a desire for distilling it down into understandable language that makes sense to people outside of the community. And I know as a religious educator that's something that I really seek to do, is to try and make this make sense to other people, like to be able to convey. And I think that so many people, I think we're probably going to talk more about this in the podcast that you and I are also recording, but that theology is up there with like philosophy and like the scary words. um, sort of like the reason that Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was changed to the Sorcerer's Stone. They figured Americans were too scared of that word. um, and I think that people are scared of the idea of theology, but don't realize that they're doing it all the time. Thinking about these big questions of the meaning of life and existence and who we are and what our purpose is, that this is all doing theological work. So it feels like it's kind of natural that it moves into this sort of activism work. I mean, so with you doing something like running the Bayard Rustin Liberation Initiative, what do you feel like is maybe like the difference between being like a faith leader doing this sort of justice-y work versus just like a normal activist? Does that question make sense?
I think
How does it help bring a little bit more to the table, do you think?
one of the things that it does is creating a different face of religion and spirituality and even Christianity. That as a black gay man living in America, in the United States, I realized that Christianity, particularly the United States version of Christianity, has been used to demoralize, dehumanize. Well, I mean, the United States version of Christianity justified the enslavement of my ancestors. Then once the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, which didn't emancipate anybody immediately, and once the Reconstruction was derailed to open the door to Jim Crow, again, the United States version of Christianity helped justify the further dehumanization and demoralization of people of color. And then we fast forward several decades to then justify the dehumanization and demoralization of LGBTQI people, and got so bad as to decide that people dying of AIDS deserve to die of AIDS because that was God's punishment, which is, if I can use a theological term that won't upset anybody, that's bullshit. So I guess for me, when that's all to say that um, I coming to this work as a faith leader, I think it's really not that different from being a quote normal activist. I think a quote normal activist is coming from their own they have their moral center, and they bring that to this work, and from their moral center, like, I need to be fighting injustice. For me, I have the same moral center as them. I just also am compelled by God to make sure, even when I'm tired of said bullshit and injustice, that I continue to work. And so essentially, it's the only difference between me and a quote normal activist is I've got a higher power that is giving me extra strength, or extra patience anyway, or yeah, extra patience and strength to do the work that I do. Because I guess I want to be very clear, because I think that's one of the issues outside of um, dehumanizing, demoralizing Black people, dehumanizing, demoralizing LGBTQ people, um, you know, justifying patriarchy, sexism, etc. Like, I think those are all the issues that come with Christianity. But I think the other issue is that I also, um, within the context of being a faith leader within Christianity, one of the things that I always am trying to be very, very cognizant of is that being a faith leader doesn't set me apart from other people or doesn't make me better than. And I think that's one of the other issues that comes from, yes, the U.S. version of Christianity, but Christianity overall, because it has, in many ways, become a kind of this kingdom on earth that Jesus specifically said he wasn't trying to create. Meanwhile, they used his movement as like the foundation and scaffolding for this um, institution that has entirely too much power. And so I guess I just say all that to say that there's really no difference between me and a normal activist. I just pray at the beginning and at the end of a public action.
I think prior to in my running away from the call times, that part also resonated with me. I did a lot of activism around trans issues, and it was, a lot of the places where we ended up holding events or where we were able to really find support in community were churches. Churches can really serve as that hub, and that place of connection and that place of community building, where we can begin to change lots of people's minds at once. And I think, one of the other things that we learned a lot about in seminary, and that I still, try and stay sort of up to date on as much as possible with my reading list, is the idea of liberation theology, of theology that's done specifically through this lens of trying to work towards the liberation of oppressed peoples. Would you say liberation theology is something that motivates you? And would you give maybe your definition of liberation theology?
Yes, yes, it liberates me. I will say that up until I, even up until I moved to the second church which the church that ended up affirming my call and helping me start my UCC ordination journey, I was still in this space of feeling Well, I was in the space of being able to own my identity as a gay man, but then I still was struggling with, well, can I be a gay Christian? And then also at some point it was, can I be a black gay Christian? And I will say that so I took the Introduction to Black Faith and Life with Reverend Dr. Lee H. Butler Jr. And that class was a transformational experience. We read all kinds of, I mean, we studied all kinds of black faith. It wasn't just Christian. I mean, essentially, it was sort of black church history meets black history that I should have been taught in school, or black U.S. history. And so it was just an amazing experience. And I will say that was where I read The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. And he wasn't there to sugarcoat. I mean, Dr. Cone wasn't there to sugarcoat, and neither was Dr. Butler. And so, and I was coming into this class as I said, as a biracial man who was born to a white family, raised around a white family. And I will say the reason that this experience was so amazing for me was that I'd come to the realization that I was struggling with the guilt from, yes, I've experienced a number of racist incidents, but I will say that I realized that I enjoyed what I will call white privilege by osmosis. Was it the same level as white people? No. But there was a level of white privilege that I was afforded growing up around white people. And then when I went into, became a journalist, I was working, all the papers I worked in, I was the first black reporter in every paper. And they were all small white towns. But my membership in the media gave me a layer of white privilege. Because there were experiences, like I was in one of the places I worked was an actual sundown town. And my job was to cover county board meetings and school board meetings out in the middle of nowhere, and then have to drive back to work and write, which generally would bring me back at like 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. And I got stopped twice by the police. The only reason that they stopped nagging me was because my white editor, finally said something. And so that's just a snapshot of the white privilege I was afforded. And I realized all of that when I got to seminary. And so, and I think that class in particular helped open my eyes to that and gave me space to sort of process that. I also took classes with Dr. Terrell, Christian ethics, systematic theology. But when I started systematic theology and reading Dr. Cone and Dr. Lightsey, it just really just gave me language to articulate all sorts of things that I had been feeling but couldn't pinpoint or couldn't speak to. So it was so at first liberation theology gave me this sort of personal strength and personal peace. And so that's what really drives me to do public theology, is because I want to be in a space where I can share the same, well, maybe not the same, but share a prophetic perspective from my context, my own personal context, because I think that that is another another avenue that I can be helpful. Because based on even even as late as 2015, 16, when I was working on my constructive theology, which are capstone at CTS for the MDiv program, it was really a struggle to find a lot of black gay theologians that really speak to issues. I mean, we've got Dr. Lightsey, who is a great womanist, lesbian womanist theologian, and there are others, but I think for me, liberation theology is really what is one of the things that really gives me that strength to continue to fight and do the work that I do, and to create space for the oppressed and the marginalized.
I think, when I started at CTS, it was something that really hit me as somebody who also grew up in the more evangelical Midwest sort of world, which is a very specific type of theology that is definitely not liberation. It is very, God's coming and going to punish everybody, or here's your ticket out of hell. Maybe you're going to get raptured, all these sorts of things. So when you get to like interact with liberation theology, where it's very much like, God is on the side of the oppressed, or in, maybe non-Christian circles, that the divine is on the side of the oppressed, or just that the church should stand on the side of the oppressed, that our communities should be on the side, and that history is on the side of working for a better world for the oppressed. All of these ideas were just really amazing to me as someone who had been, the only idea that I had of God, the divine, anything like that growing up was, you're going to hell, and if you better believe, or else you'll have to just spend forever in punishment. And it's just such a different thing. And I think the other really beautiful thing, I took a few queer theology courses, and that was like getting to see how you could like use that lens to then look at these scriptural stories. And I now even, apply those same sort of lenses to just other things that I read critically. But like that you look for the queer happenings, that you look for issues around binaries when you're looking for maybe like a trans reading. And it's really, it's a great skill to be able to come to learn, to be able to find meaning in the text that maybe even the original authors didn't intend, but that you can find that deeper liberatory meaning. And I've always found that really, really meaningful. So you mentioned like Dr. Cone, and Crossing the Lynching Tree is like a huge Black liberation theology sort of text. And you mentioned womanist theology, and so there's all these different kind of liberation theologies that are flowering out of this movement. Do you think, I think some people are often like worried, like, is this something I'm allowed to engage in as somebody not in that community? But B, do you have recommendations for things for people to dive into to learn a little bit more about these kind of liberation theologies?
One, I don't think that one has to be in a particular community to be able to and to learn from these theologies. So, for example, of my cohort who was in, there are a few people in my cohort that were in the class with me that were 3 white people. I mean, they're all people that I'm still friends with to this day, and they all were transformed by that experience. So I don't believe that black theology is only for black people, or queer theology should be just for queer people. I think that um, black theology, queer theology, theology from theologians of other theologians of color are all important, because I think theology is another way of, from those theologians, is another way of learning about the experiences in the context of people of color. I think not only do I think, but I think it's the reality that the root of racism and homophobia and sexism is ignorance. Now, am I saying that reading one, you know, passage from, feminist theology or womanist theology or black theology or queer theology is going to cure you of all your isms? Like, no, but I think it is a way of learning about a community that you may have struggled to connect with before. And it gives you insight into where they are. So, for example, so I took queer theologies with Patrick Chang, and that for me was helpful because I understood, like, I've seen, besides looking in the mirror, I've seen other black LGBTQ people, but I had never necessarily hadn't had the opportunity to interact with. So, for example, someone of Asian descent, and then Asian isn't necessarily too specific, because there are different types of people who are of Asian descent who can be Korean, Chinese. So I don't want to make sure that I also recognize those different communities within that label. And so for me, being in that class, again, as we learned in seminary, that your personal context also informs your theology. So to learn, even as he shared through his book Ramble Theology, and I can't remember, there was another book that he taught from, another one of his books he taught from. While yes, he talked about like these different types of theologies, he still at the core was teaching from his context and shared his own personal story within the context of that. So I really appreciated learning from him, and then learning from Dr. Lightsey, because in as much as yes, she and I are both black people who are in the LGBTQI community, I still have male privilege, and so learning from her context about that is really important. So I guess what I say is that I think that exposing yourself to a variety of liberation theologies is very, very important, because it's essentially a gateway of exposing yourself to different cultures and perspectives, or perspectives that are influenced by cultures and personal experiences, that I think in one way helps break down barriers that could keep us from seeing each other's humanity.
When you named something that I really love about liberation theology, and that is that especially growing up in that more evangelical, traditional theological world, you're told that like theology is what's in the Bible and that's it. And I love the beauty of getting to speak from our context, to dream our dreams, to think about what liberation looks like for us and what our lives have been like, and letting that inform things. And that's not a bad thing. I think it's just a beautiful part of liberation theology. I suppose as a final wrap up question, and then also folks, stay tuned for a podcast coming from us later this month. As a final wrap up question, what if we were if tomorrow we woke up and it was a fully liberated world, what is your vision for a liberated world? What does that look like? What is that dream that drives you?
A liberated world to me is a space where you're truly not judged by what color you are, what you look like, how much you weigh, your sexual orientation, your sexual identity, your gender expression, that you're just simply thought of as if you are of faith, considered a creation of God just like anyone else. If you're not of faith, you consider each other as a fellow human that are in a world where we're all able to live in harmony and peace, where no one is begging for validation or basic affirmation or struggling to prove their worth, where parents don't throw their kids away, and where there aren't people living in tent cities. I think just basically my dream is being in a world where we treat each other with dignity and respect, and where everyone has enough and no one is worrying about where their next meal is coming from.
Beautiful vision. Jason, it's been so wonderful to get to sit down with you. I'm excited to also be recording the podcast. But thank you so much for joining Fourth Universalist tonight. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much.